So I'm going to start recording again. And so I'm still in my the template scene that you guys can download and open. And you can follow along if you want. You can also just watch and start on your own later. But I'm basically just going to make a really simple scene. I'm going to add a ground and add some like basic objects. One of the main concepts that I want to be talking about is how scenes are used in Godot. Scenes are basically like the building blocks. So sometimes a scene is like a level that has all the information for a level. Sometimes a scene is like a menu that just has like buttons. One of the scene we have now is just the player. It's just a player. And the reason we have the player in its own scene is because we have a lot of different levels and we're going to drop the player into all of those different levels. So instead of recreating the player each time we make a level, we make this component that's a scene and then we drop it into other scenes. So a lot of the time, once we start to realize like, oh, I want to use this more than once, then I'm going to make a separate component scene so I can put it into multiple. So I'm going to start with a new scene. So when I open Godot, I'm usually going to have like this thing that just says empty, and it says create a root node. And since we're working in 3D, we can use a 3D node, which is like a spatial node. You don't have to. You could use just a default node because the scene always has one node at the top that everything else is inside of. For the player scene, the root node is actually a kinematic body that has special physics properties. But for our first 3D scene, I'm just going to use a 3D scene. I'm going to say spatial here. And the first thing I usually want to do is give that main node a name. So I'm going to call this level 1. Just as a default, this is my first level. Then I'm going to save it so that, I want to make sure to save it. I'm going to save it inside of my scenes folder. And it already says level 1 here. I'm going to click save. And so that's all it is right now. It's just like an origin point, basically. So a spatial node has a transform, and that's pretty much it. There's nothing else on here. There's nothing special about this particular node. It's more like a folder for organizing stuff. Like if you have a folder for everything you want in level 1 in your project, this is like that folder where you're going to put all that stuff in. So the first thing we're going to do is add in our player. So all of our levels are going to have our player in them. So this is called instancing. When I add one scene into another, it's called instancing. The way I instance something is using this instance button here, little link. So I click on this and it shows me all the other scenes that I have, and I want to add in my player. So I click open, and then if I hit F, zoom in a little bit, there's my player. So I have an instance, I have a copy of my player scene inside of my level. And if I click, the nice thing about this is if I click on this little scene icon, it opens my player in another scene. So I can edit the player, and the changes I make to the player scene are going to update in all of the scenes that the player is in, all of the levels or anything else. I can also click on this script, and it brings me over to the script editor. And then there's also the eyeball to turn it on and off. Okay, so I have a player in my scene, and if I play the scene, I'm just kind of like in space, right? Like there's nothing in here. Okay, so let's add some stuff in here. So if I hit escape, it'll quit the scene. So I want to start with a ground. Okay, so this is our first object that we're going to create. And there's more components than you might think go into creating one object because we're in 3D, and everything in 3D is more complicated than it is in 2D for a lot of reasons. So we have to be able to see this thing from all different angles. So we have to tell the computer how to render the object from any angle. With that, we might move around. We also have to tell this thing how to interact with the player. So if the player is on the ground, they shouldn't fall through, right? They're going to stand on the ground. Okay, so we have to tell it how it looks, what color it is, how big it is, and where the player can interact with it. So there's a lot of information that goes into building one object. So to start, since the ground doesn't move, I'm going to use a special physics object called a static body. Static means it doesn't move. So I'm going to click the plus, and I could search for it by going through and like looking at all this crap. But I'm just going to type in the search bar because I know what I'm looking for is a static body. So it'll show me there's a static body in 2D. I don't want 2D, so I'm going to close this. Just going to choose this static body, click create. Okay, and then I'm going to change the name of this to ground. So far nothing's happened, right? We don't see anything on the screen. There's no ground yet. We basically just told Godot that we want this body to exist, but we have to give it a lot more information about how it works. And it actually has a little warning here. It says this has no shape. So all the static body does is it says we want something that doesn't move, that things can run into. Okay, so we need two things. We need to be able to see it, and we need to be able to run into it. Those are actually two different things. You can have an object that looks like it's this big, but you don't run into it until you're past where it looks like. So those are two different things. There's what we see, and then what we can actually run into. So what we see is called a mesh. So that's the first thing I'm going to add is a mesh. And I'm just going to add a mesh instance. Okay, so I just want the generic mesh instance. It looks like a little box. A mesh in 3D is just like a collection of points that defines a shape. So we say where all the points are, and then the 3D geometry fills in the space around it. So in our mesh, we have to choose a shape. So the first thing we do when we have a mesh for our ground is we go over to where it says mesh and click on this empty, and we have a lot of options here. We have different shapes, we have text, we have array where we actually type in the points that we want. We're going to go with the simple cube mesh. Cube is just like a box. So when we type in cube, now we actually see something. So that's pretty cool. So we want to change the size of the mesh, right? Our level is not going to be just a cube. So to change the properties of the mesh, I click on the box, and you can see there's more properties. So sometimes in the inspector, there's actually more stuff than what you see to begin with. So I click on the box, and I have a size. One of the things that's tricky about Godot is the size. The way we measure size for the mesh and the physics object are different. I'll show you in a second. So for the size, let's do something big. Let's say we want our ground to be like 30 units, which is meters for Godot. And we'll leave for the height 2 is fine. And we'll do 30 for the Z. Okay, our player's inside the ground, but we're going to fix that later. So that's a pretty big ground. We could probably make it bigger, actually. Let's just leave it for now. You can always make it bigger. Okay, so that's our mesh. That's what it looks like. Okay. So one thing real quick. In this class, we're not going to spend a lot of time. Yeah. Okay. So in this class, we're not going to about like the visual component of 3D design, like shaders, materials, and stuff like that. There's too much to talk about, basically. we're going to focus on design and interaction. There's going to be some new classes in the animation department that are going to talk a lot more about that type of stuff. But we don't want just white blocks everywhere. So we can add a material. I made some default materials here. So if you just throw a material on here like that, there's a little blue grid, there's a little gray checker, a little green grid. You can make different ones of this if you want. If you want to just make a default material, you can also just click new spatial material, click on the material, and then the color is going to be inside of this albedo property. So materials are really complicated. Materials have all these different properties for how objects interact with light. And so there's a lot of different things that you can change, but just to keep things simple, you want to change the color, you can change the albedo. And if you want to add a texture, you can throw it in here. So here are those default textures. Here's like the grid one. One thing that you'll notice is that when I add the grid in here, it looks weird. The way that you can fix that, the only other property I'm going to show you with this is under the UVs. Go to UV1. UV is the rules about how the texture gets applied to the mesh, like where it goes in the mesh. Turn triplanar on. What? Flatten it? Oh, that's under mesh. Click on the mesh thing and then change the size. So the X, I made 30 on the X axis and 30 on the Y axis. Yeah, so anyway, with the material, you can click on triplanar. That will wrap the material around the mesh. And then if you want to change the size, just change the scale. If you want to make it smaller, make it scale larger. If you want to make the texture bigger, make the scale smaller. So 0.1. So you can make your own materials pretty quickly that way if you want to. You can throw other images in there if you want to. I just put a few basics in there just to speed things up, but you don't have to use mine. There's a ton of other stuff in here I'm not going to go over right now, but that's how we can add a material if you want some color and some texture. So that's visually what we want, right? This is visually shows us where the ground is. Okay, so let's move the player up so they're above the ground. And I'm going to play the scene again. And look what happens. I can see the ground, but I fall right through, right? Because I haven't added any physics yet. So that's the second part. So there's the visual, and then there's the physics. So that's my mesh. The next part I'm going to add is my collision shape. So I'm going to click the plus again. I'm going to type in collision. So the collision shape defines where things run into it. This is like a completely different shape. The collision shape doesn't actually have to even match the mesh. Like I could do something where I make my collision shape, excuse me, like a capsule like the player. And then my player, let's see what happens. My player is probably going to land. Okay, I landed on this little capsule, but as soon as I move, I'm going to slide off the edge. So my collision shape doesn't have to match the mesh, but it'll be better if it does, right? So I'm going to change this to match the mesh. So I'm going to change the collision shape to a box. And then here's where it gets confusing. When I click on the box, to start, this box is really small. It looks like that. But I want it to match the visual. But the collision shapes are measured in extents, not in size. So with my mesh, the size is the actual size. With the collision shape, the extents are how far it is from the center. So the collision shape is always going to be half of what your size is. So the extents for the x are whatever half of 30 is, 15. And then the y I left at 2, so it's 1. And then z is 15. And you can see these little blue lines line up now. Okay, so if I went too far, if I did that, you'd see that my mesh actually goes too far. I do that, then I can suddenly walk, unless I go on the wrong. Okay, I went off the wrong side. Uh, so let's go this way. Okay, see now I can walk in the air because my collision shape goes farther than my mesh. So we want them to match. So I'm going to turn this back to 15. And now I'm done. I've got my shape. That's everything that I need to do. So now when I go back to my ground, I can move the ground and it's going to move both the mesh and the shape at the same time. So that's good because every time I move the mesh, I'd have to move the collision shape. I don't want to do that. But if I move the ground, I can move them together. So let's put the ground at -1. So it's right at this like grid here. And then I can move my player down a little bit. The other thing I can do is I can actually scale the ground. So if I go to the transform for my main ground node, I can go to transform and I can scale it. I could say 2 here, but notice that it stretches the material. Okay, so I might not want that if I'm just trying to change the size. So changing the size through the ground part is a little tricky. What I might want to do instead is go back to my mesh. And let's say I want to make it longer. I can make this 60, but I have to remember to go to my collision shape and make this half of that value. So it is a little tricky when you're working with these objects. You always have to be matching sizes. Okay, another thing to notice real quick, notice that my level has this little arrow next to it. If I close it, it hides everything inside of it. Same thing with my ground. This is how we know which things are part of which things. Excuse me. That's why I can move the ground and it doesn't move my player. But if I move my whole level, everything moves at the same time. And so you have to be really careful about making sure your nodes are in the right place. So my ground has to have a mesh and a collision. If my mesh was like out here, now if I move the ground, I still have this mesh over here, but it's not overlapping with the right thing. So I'm going to fall through. So I always need to make sure I have my shapes set up correctly. Yeah, undo this. Okay. So I'm going to go over creating a couple objects, and I'm going to kind of repeat what I've already done, just to review it a little bit. And then after that, I'm going to stop and you guys can on stuff. Okay. So let's say I want to add something in this scene. Now I've got this scene with a ground, and I can basically walk around, but it's not very exciting. You know, there's nothing to do. So let's add some stuff in here. I'm just going to add some trees. So what I'm going to do before I do anything else, and this is the way I want to always like organize the content in Godot and in most like 3D programs. If I have an object, I always want to start with a generic node and then put stuff into the object most of the time. It's going to make my life easier as I go. So I'm going to start with level 1. I'm going to add a little a generic node. So I'm just going to add a spatial node and call this tree. Okay. Now in here, in the tree, I'm going to add a trunk and I'm going to add some leaves. Okay, so those are both going to be static bodies. I want my player to be able to run into both the trunk and the leaves. You don't have to do that. Maybe the leaves the player can walk through and the trunk they run into, but I'm going to set it up so that both are static. So I'm going to go plus, and I'm going to find a static body and add 1, 2 static body. Notice that I accidentally added the second one inside of the first one. I don't want that, so I'm going to drag this guy out. There we go. So I have my tree trunk, and I have my leaves. And each one of these is going to need a mesh and a collision shape. So let's go to the trunk, add a mesh. I'll just type in mesh and add it. Same thing here. And they both need a collision shape. So I'm going to add a collision shape. Okay, so you can see this is going to start to get a little bit tedious, but we're going to keep going. So let's start with the trunk. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And I'm going to hide my player for a second. So for my trunk, I'm going to go with a cylinder mesh. Okay, so this is a different shape. It's a circle. So that looks pretty cool. I'm going to click on here. So for a tree trunk, notice that it's overlapping because it draws from the middle. Everything in 3D is drawing from the middle. Yeah. Okay, so I've got my cylinder. So the cylinder has different properties, right? It's not just width and height. It has a top radius, so it can turn into a small cylinder, bottom radius, and then a height. So let's set the height of the tree to 8. And let's say the bottom radius is 1, and the top radius, well, let's say the bottom radius is 2, and the top radius is 1. So we get a little bit of a tapering off. And let's actually make it a little taller. Let's say 16. And notice how, or actually, let's set it back to 8. Notice how half of my tree is underground. So in 3D, everything draws from the center. Excuse me. Excuse me. So I'm going to grab my trunk and drag it up a little bit. If I want to be precise, I can open the transform and just type in 4. And now it's going to be on top of the ground. Sorry, I've been coughing a lot today. I'll make it. Okay. So let's add our collision shape. We're going to get a new cylinder shape. And now we have to match this. So the height is 8. And now our radius is just, it doesn't give us an option for the bottom radius and the top radius. So let's just do 1.5. We'll kind of split the difference. So the player will run into the tree, but not until it gets like a little bit inside. That's okay. We don't mind that too much. So we can't always be perfectly precise. The computer is going to optimize for performance over visuals a lot of the time. Okay, so I've got my collision shape. I could, if I wanted to, like build a custom tree in Blender or Cinema 4D or something like that and put it in here, but this is good enough for now. Let's give our tree trunk a color. So I'm going to go to the mesh instance, go to the material, new spatial, click on the material. I'm just going to change the albedo color to brown, something like that. Okay, we've got our trunk. Now let's do our leaves. So I'm going to move the leaves up to the top of the trunk. And if I want that to be exact, I can go to my transform and 8. And mesh instance, for this one, I'm going to use a sphere mesh. So that's a sphere. And so let's make this a little bigger. I can change the radius and I can change the height. So let's change the radius to 2 and the height to 4. That looks pretty good. Maybe a little bit bigger. Let's say 4 and 6. That's a pretty good tree. Let's set the material real quick. So I'm just going to make this green. Okay, that looks fine. Okay, now the collision shape, that's the last bit. So I'm going to go to shape. This is a sphere shape. And let's click on the sphere shape. And for the radius, it'll say 2. Again, this isn't going to match exactly. Or no, it's I think 4. But we just want it to be close enough. It doesn't have to be perfect. Let's make it like, okay, that'll be good enough. Okay, so now I've got this tree, right? And so I'm going to show you guys a couple different things I can do with the tree. So I can obviously move it around, move it over here. And now if I play the scene again, there's my tree. If I walk over there, I'm going to run into it. That's pretty cool. I can't really jump high enough to get on the tree. I'll show you guys how to fix that later. But there you go. So the last thing I want to do is look at how do I make more trees? And this is an important thing when we talk about instancing and using components, using different scenes. So a quick way to make a new tree is I can right click on my tree and go down to duplicate. And I have a new tree right there in my hierarchy. I can move it over there. So that's pretty cool. That was easy, right? Now I have 2 trees. But if I change one of my trees, so let's go to tree 2, let's go to the leaves, and let's look at the material. If I go to material and I change the color, see how it changes both? That's because it's using the same material. Okay, so I made a copy of this tree. If I want it not to do that, I can right click and I can say reparent. Or wait, no, is that what I do? No, that's not what I want to do. Where is it? If I click on this, is it here? Oh, maybe it's, yeah, okay. All right. If I want to make a new material, I can click on this and go here and I can say make unique. So I've made a new material. Now when I change the color, it only affects my copy. It doesn't affect the original. Okay, same thing if I want to change the shape. So if I go back up to my mesh here and I change the radius, it's going to change both of them. If I only wanted to change one, I go to make unique. And now if I set this back to 4, it only affects one of them. Okay, so that's if I make a copy. Another thing I can do is I can turn my tree into its very own scene, its own component. And then I can instance my tree as many times as I want. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to click on the tree, I'm going to right click, and I'm going to say save branch as scene. Go to scenes and just call it tree. Now I have a new scene. If I open this up, this new scene is just my tree. So there's one tricky part here. Notice that the new scene, the tree is like over here. But when I put the scene into new scenes, I want it to be in the middle so I can move it as though it's in the middle. So when I create a new scene, I just want to go to the tree, go to transform, and refresh it. So now it's in the middle. Okay. So now watch this. If I go back to my level, see how it updated that tree because I moved it. But I can take this version of the tree and move it over here. And now look, my tree doesn't have a hierarchy anymore. I have to click on the scene to go over here. This tree 2 still has a hierarchy. And I can instance more trees. I can say tree, click open. Let's put this down here. And I can put this tree over here. And I can do it again. I can actually just duplicate this version of it. There's another tree. So the cool thing about this is if I go to my original tree scene and I want to change the color or something, let's go to my material. Let's say I change the color to something like this. Now when I go back to the level, it updates all those trees. So now I can edit the trees separately. And then I can use these trees in other levels. I can put them wherever I want. So if I have a component that I'm going to use a lot, it's a good idea to make an instance of that component. So again, the way that I did that is I right click and I went to save branch as scene. Okay, so that's a lot to cover. I'm going to stop there and give you guys the rest of the class to just work on your own. So we have another 50 minutes for you guys to just play around with stuff. I'm just going to talk about the first assignment a little bit before, so you guys have some sense of what we're working towards. So for the first several weeks, we're just going to be working on this really simple scene. So it's just going to be a first person scene. And I just want you guys to build basically like a fun level that is really just like bare bones, just using primitive shapes and design to create something fun to walk around. So we're not going to add in a lot of like physics or a lot of like interaction, or we're not going to have enemies. We're not going to have all this other stuff. We're just going to start by focusing on this like basic concept of creating objects and designing a space. For now, I really just want you guys to start simple. Just add different shapes. So I've only covered a few shapes. I've only covered boxes and cylinders and spheres. There's other shapes that you can try. But as you're creating it, try to think about like what's something really fun or cool that I can make with just these really basic geometries. Like what would be a fun space to walk around in? I'll go over a little bit more next class about some different things that you can. But I'm going to stop here for you guys just to get started, just with the basics, just playing with the geometry, playing with different shapes, and moving stuff around. So I'm going to stop the recording.